everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I'm going to be talking about what makes a good retelling. If you couldn't tell already, I love retellings. I love reading them, and I also wrote one. So my debut novel, Brightly Burning, is Jane Eyre in space. So I basically took a classic that I love and I transposed it in a totally different environment to kind of twist it and make it work for a modern YA audience. Now this is just one of many different ways that you can approach a retelling, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna go over different ways that you can think about doing retellings and also the things that you want to keep in mind when you are tackling a retelling so that it is fresh and exciting and, well, good. So I'd say that Brightly Burning is a pretty, what I would call, faithful retelling. It follows the same characters and the same basic storyline and plot beats. It's just been transposed into a new genre, a new setting, and specifically I made some adaptation choices to really make it a full and proper young adult novel. But it is basically Jane Eyre in space. The pitch gives you an idea of exactly what it is. A great example of another quite faithful YA retelling is Great by Sarah Benin-Kaza. It is a modern retelling of The Great Gatsby, and it is also gender swapped, so Jay and Gatsby are girls. This is essentially a queer retelling of The Great Gatsby. I really like this book. I think Sarah made some really good choices with how to update and adapt it. Another one of my favorite examples is For Darkness Shows the Stars by Diana Peterfreund. This is a science fiction take on persuasion. So she's taken Jane Austen's Persuasion, and it is in a sci-fi dystopian future. So it takes a story that is not sci-fi at all, or certainly not dystopian, and twists all of the details and kind of the things that people love about Persuasion to put it in this new exciting setting. There are also retellings that are essentially just inspired by the things that they are based on. They start with the idea of and the love of the thing, often with similar characters, some of the same tropes, even some of the same beats, but they really spin off in their own direction. One good example of this is Sarah J. Maas's books. Throne of Glass started out as a Cinderella retelling, but it really grew really far from that original premise. But if you do read Throne of Glass, just the first book, you can kind of see that DNA of Cinderella. Similarly, A Court of Thorns and Roses is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but Sarah does, high fantasy with fae and spins it off in a totally different direction, inspired by but not direct retellings of these fairy tales. Another really good example that's pretty recent that I love is Winter Song by S.J. Jones. This is inspired by Labyrinth, the movie with David Bowie, but also just the mythos of Der Erlkönig, which is a real thing, the Goblin King. So it is not actually a retelling of Labyrinth, but if you are a fan of the movie, as I am, as S.J. Jones is, you will feel the DNA of the original thing, especially in kind of the tone and the feel and vibe of the romance in this book. The next type or category of retelling is taking one thing about the source material and totally twisting it to give a completely different perspective to the story. These takes can still be pretty faithful, or they can be totally different, like the inspired by category. A good example of this would be the Dorothy Must Die series by Danielle Page. It comes at the Wizard of Oz stories from a completely different direction, changing everything you think you know about the original, and it alters the tone and it tells a different story, but it's clearly inspired by the universe, but it's nice and twisty. Another example that I think kind of straddles a few categories, it really straddles the three that I've gone over, and that is Cinder by Marissa Meyer. It is pretty faithful to Cinderella, but it's transposed into a completely different setting, but she also twists things and is also generally inspired by, but not completely religious to the original. There's no set way to do a retelling or one category that you have to fall into. You want to think about lots of different ways to do retellings and the ways to make yours feel fresh. These are just some examples, with some books falling neatly into those categories and others straddling the lines. Yet another way to tackle a retelling that I love this approach, I love reading them, is telling the same story or setting your story, retold in the same universe, but from the point of view of a completely unexpected character, thus changing everything. These are often villain origin stories or the true story of what really happened, but from the perspective of an unexpected character. A great recent example in YA is Forest of a Thousand Lanterns by Julie Dow. This is technically a Snow White retelling. It is the evil queen and her origin story set in a Chinese setting and inspired by Chinese culture and myths. There are a lot of Snow White retellings out there, but what Julie did was really frame it from an unexpected angle. This is the evil queen as a teenager, and it's giving all sorts of new and different backstory to how she might have turned out the way that she did. My other example is also actually Cinderella. These are the ones that came to mind easily, and the funny thing is that it's not a YA novel. It is a Disney direct-to-video sequel. I know I'm weird. I ended up watching this with my friend's kid. It came on the Disney Channel, and I liked it. It is called Cinderella, A Twist in Time, and yes, it is a time travel direct-to-video sequel from Disney, and I was pleasantly surprised. I really liked this movie, and it is basically told from the point of view of Anastasia. There is a mishap with the magic wand. They go back in time, and because of stuff, Anastasia ends up marrying the prince instead of Cinderella, and it's kind of an alternate reality or alternate universe version of Cinderella, but it adds a lot of depth to Anastasia because she gets what she wants, but then she's miserable and she realizes the wrong thing happened, and it redeems her character arc, and of course it all ends up in a happy ending. But I thought it was a weird, twisty, unexpected take on Cinderella. So don't be afraid to think outside of the box when you are approaching your retelling, because what makes a good retelling? The number one thing is you need to be fresh. What new thing are you bringing to the story, and basically what is the point of your retelling? The thing is, the source material will always exist. If you're not going to bring something new to it and be fresh, give it a new spin, give it new depth, people can always just go to the original, whatever that is. So you always want to think about what new thing you are bringing to the table, especially when it comes to stories that have been told and retold many, many times. You want to find a new approach to it to make it yours. I think that people love retellings because, of course, we do have beloved stories and the original just isn't quite enough. But when we go to a retelling, we want to see a balance of the things we love about the original fused with something new and exciting. A weird magic time travel mishap where Anastasia ends up marrying the prince instead is new and weird and kind of exciting. It's an interesting new angle to the story, and so I gladly watched a Disney direct-to-video sequel to Cinderella. So when you're choosing to do a retelling, you want to think like, what's the fresh or different thing that you want to see brought to the story that you love? There's a number of ways to think about what's fresh and approach it. You can do a new genre, you can do a new setting, you can do changes to the characters, or like I mentioned, you can tell it from the point of view of a new character. You can do it through fusing stories with new cultural angles and takes, though I have a caveat about that, which I will get to in just a minute. And there is also gender flipping, like I mentioned with Sarah Benincaza's Great, and other new twists that you can come up with to make the story new, exciting, and different. But about new cultures and using new cultural approaches to make stories fresh. Yes, but. As with all things, yes, but. The key here is not to culturally appropriate. It is not appropriate to be like, how can I make this new and original? I know, I'm going to borrow from someone else's culture that is not my culture. That is a pretty cheap tactic for making something feel fresh, just kind of taking from something that is not yours and affixing it on to your story. That is not the best approach. I've I've talked about this before in videos, and I've also said before, and I stand by it, that I am not the authority or person to tell you what to do with diversity and how you approach other cultures in YA fiction, except to say that you should be respectful and circumspect, because so often when you ask yourself the question, am I the right person to tell this story in this way, the answer is going to be no. So think about new twists, but do not appropriate from other people's cultures. That's just a little note. I'm not gonna let that take over the video though, because that could be an entire video topic. Be sure to hit key scenes and beats that fans of the story love. This means if you're doing a Pride and Prejudice retelling, you have to have the Darcy letter, you have to have, or the equivalent, you have to have the scene where Darcy snubs Elizabeth at the dance. What are the moments in the story that people identify with the story and that people love? You don't have to write them verbatim. This is where, again, you have to think fresh and twisty and find new ways and approaches to it. But if you leave out too many beloved elements, making it almost unrecognizable, in many cases the fans will not be happy with you. Now, I did talk about that whole, genre where you're just inspired by the story. That is okay. And in those cases, I say don't bill it as a retelling. You want to use that inspired by tags so that they are not let down when you don't have all of the same beats. But if you are going for anything that is a more faithful retelling, you want to hit the same key character and plot scenes. You also want to think about the themes of the original and how you're going to explore them. You don't want to completely change the themes and ideas and heart of the story that you are retelling, because again, you're going to end up it's like a bait and switch. The reader's going to come for one thing and then you hit them with something else and they're going to be like, but that's not the point of the original. I'm not saying you can't get a little different and a little twisty, but generally speaking, you want to stick with the heart of the story that you are retelling. You also want to look at what I call the emotional arc of the original and how you can mirror that in your retelling. It's not necessarily about copying beat for beat everything in the original, but replicating the emotional arcs of not only the characters in the story, but also the emotional reading arc of the reader. What journey does the reader who loves this original go on when they are experiencing the story? Where are the moments where they feel tense or anticipation or, the satisfying culmination of a romantic relationship, that happy ending or unhappy ending in the case of some fairy tales, for example? What are those emotional beats that you need to be hitting as a writer? And how can you hit those same beats even if you're not copying the story verbatim? Those inspired by stories very often hit those same emotional arcs as the originals. They just do it in a completely different way, but they're still satisfying to fans of the original for that reason. So some of my favorite tips for tackling a revision. First of all, don't be afraid to make changes. As much as I've talked about being, faithful to what fans of the original love, faithful doesn't mean it's a verbatim play-by-play of the original story. Faithful does have to do with the feelings and the emotions and the themes, some of the characters and pivotal scenes. But in order to make it fresh, you have to make changes. If something just isn't working for you, change it. And being totally honest, some beloved stories have elements to them that simply do not work for modern readers and just in modern society. In order to properly adapt them for a modern reader or a new genre, you're going to have to make changes. Sometimes those are big changes. For example, in classics, very often you're going to have to address things like sexism, racism, different historical context for, women's position in society, misogyny, rape culture, poor depiction of mental health, agency for women. There are so many things that you will see in classics that if you copy them verbatim and you don't make any sensible changes for, the modern sensibility and modern reader, it could be problematic, is the nice way that I'm going to say that. And let me give you a little personal anecdata on that. So I did make some very conscious choices to update elements of Jane Eyre because I love Jane Eyre, but it is very much a novel of its era. And there are a couple of things about it that I was a bit uncomfortable with, and I just changed them. I didn't have any problem with it. For example, big change, my Rochester is not in his 40s. It is no longer a romance between a much older man with a power differential between him and the 18-year-old love interest. That is gone. They are on a pretty even playing field when it comes to age, and it's a YA novel, so of course there are. There were also some depictions of mental health that made me very uncomfortable with the original Jane Eyre, and I did make some tweaks there as well. That's just to give you an idea that it is definitely okay to make changes to something if, it feels dated or you are uncomfortable with it. You also may have to tweak story structure. A lot of stories, older stories especially, including classics and fairy tales, do not have modern story structure. Now, this isn't a bad thing, and you don't always have to religiously adhere to 3-act structure, but in some cases you may find that a beloved story, when you try to translate it into a modern novel, and especially a YA novel, that certain things may make that challenging. It might not have the pacing that it needs to have or the character arc that it needs to have, and so seriously, don't be afraid to make changes. Again, using my book as an example, I'll tell you, I felt that the 3rd act of Jane Eyre was a bit inert. She wanders the moors and finds this family and becomes a teacher, and time passes and stuff happens, and then the ending happens. I completely changed the 3rd act of Jane Eyre for the purposes of my YA novel. I added a lot of conflict and stakes to make the 3rd act a bit quite different and a lot more exciting. And you just have to be, unafraid to make those big changes in order to make it work for your story. Having good pacing and having a book feel fresh and appropriate for our time, not another time, is really, really key. Related, you just want to think about the time in which you are writing your retelling, who you are as a writer, and who your reader is. Don't feel pressure to emulate the style of the originals. I find this mostly comes up with classics. Like, you don't have to write it in, old-timey or beautiful literary style. You can take a similar story and really, muck it up and make it modern, give it your storytelling voice and something that is going to work for modern readers. You do not have to religiously adhere to the way in which the original story was told. And similar to that, I advise you to get a bit, experimental and messy and dirty when it comes to genre and setting. I see that quite often people who do retelling stay pretty close to the setting or the time period of the original, and sometimes just breaking out of that mold can make a huge difference. So that could be doing a contemporary retelling, it could be doing a completely different historical period, it could be taking something that was a fantasy and making it a sci-fi, or taking something that had magic and making it technology. Just think about ways to break away from the form and the genre of the original so that it just feels, again, more fresh. And last but certainly not least, the most important thing to remember: there will never be any one retelling that will universally make fans of the original happy. You just can't please everyone. Ultimately, every retelling is going to have its own flavor and DNA and twist and interpretation of the original. It's your interpretation. It's the things that you find interesting, that you want to write, that you think readers might like to read, or a certain type of reader. You're not going to make all readers of a story happy. So if you're retelling a classic, it's just statistically not possible that 100% of the people who love that classic are going to like the way that you choose to retell it, or a fairy tale, or what have you. This is why there can be more than one retelling of the same story. Or if there's a retelling that was done 10 years ago, you could do it now because there's a bit of time and distance and you are giving it a fresh new take. One of the reasons I love retellings is that the creative possibilities are near endless. There's so many different things that you can do and lots of different ways to connect with readers who love it. You can also bring a story that you love to a whole new audience who has no clue about the original. The possibilities are endless. I'm going to be doing another video all about how to choose the right story for your retelling. I'll get a bit more into, where to find source material and things to consider when you are choosing your retelling, like the dreaded market. But that is another video for another time. I hope you enjoyed this. Please, as always, drop questions or comments down below. I'd love to hear, anything that you were unsure about or things that I left out. These are just my ideas on retellings, but there's so much more to say about them. I also love book recs. Rec some of your favorite retellings down below in the comments. Any genre, not just YA, but I do love a good YA retelling. If you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel and be sure to hit the notification bell so you are notified whenever I post a new video. I post 2 to 3 times a week and I love talking about all things writing, traditional publishing, and about YA books in general. So thank you so much for watching, and as always everyone, happy writing.